Hi, welcome to a 5-hour review on NewbGaming, where I play the first 5 hours of a game and let you know my thoughts after. Breathedge, yes, that is really how you say it, is a single-player, open-world, survival craft, indie, sandbox game set in space. It was officially released, version 1.0, in February of 2021, but there's been a lot of early access available to portions of the game before this date. Personally, I'm a big fan of open-world games, and I love all things space or astronomy, so this game seemed right up my alley. Looking at the trailer for this game, it looks very similar to Subnautica, but set in space. There looks to be lots of crafting, base building, vehicles, that kind of stuff. I would like to point out that I try really hard to not look at other reviews or opinions prior to playing these games for the first time. I don't want to go into anything with a bias. Sometimes you can't help hearing things and getting hyped about games prior to their launch. Insert cyberpunk joke. But for this game, I was able to stay mostly isolated and come into it with very little prior knowledge of what I was jumping into. Full price for this game will set you back $25 US, but during launch I was able to pick it up for $18. So based on price alone, I'm not expecting this to be a AAA title, which is fine for the kind of game it is. The $20 mark does seem to be the sweet spot for games of this genre, so that aligns with most of its competition. This game comes from the indie developer Red Ruin Software, and I believe this is the first game release from them, which really is quite impressive when you look at what this game could be. Now, finally, onto the game itself. The introduction to this game is a bit odd, but entertaining in that you start the game having your body drug in front of a couple serious-looking robotic mafia things with electronic faces or something. They're made of coffins? They do a brief interrogation trying to determine how you escape from some event, but you really don't know what's going on. And the game gives you some choices on how to respond to their interrogations. You can spit on them, and you do get some funny responses and facial expressions out of the coffin mafia guys, but ultimately your choices don't matter much. So the whole game is you telling these guys the story of how you escaped, which starts at the beginning, which is that you were attempting to bring your grandfather's coffin and chicken aboard the unnamed interstellar space liner to be buried, only to be interrupted midway by your ship crashing and watching your grandfather's coffin literally slip away into space in front of you. So you're left stranded in space and need to find a way back home. Besides the whole grandfather's coffin part, it's a pretty straightforward space game story. Ship crashes, gotta get home. Get from point A on your crashed ship with a plain, simple spacesuit, a handful of food and water, and a chicken, to point B, the rendezvous point with the rescue ship. The mechanics of the game are easy enough. Get materials from the surrounding crash site to craft food, water, and upgrades for your spacesuit to allow you to escape. At least in the early game, there aren't any aliens or robots trying to hunt you down or anything. There's only one ever-present enemy in the game: air. During the absolute entirety of this game, you'll be fighting a never-ending battle with the oxygen gauge. Every time you leave the ship, a stopwatch starts counting down to your death. Run out, grab some materials: ice, nutrient goo, metal, cloth, wire, rubber, etc. And get back to the ship before the clock runs out. Leave the ship, grab more materials. Get back before you run out of air. Leave the ship to explore a new portion of the wreckage. Get back to the ship before you run out of air. Rinse and repeat. When your oxygen meter starts to run low, the game gives you a warning in both a message appearing on your screen, and it begins to play this foreboding music, reminding you that you need to head back to the ship immediately. You'll be hearing this music a lot as you play this game. The sense of dread you'll get at various points in the game when you realize you ventured out a bit too far or stuck around outside of the ship for a bit too long can be sickening. You'll find yourself staring at that meter all too often. There is a very simple crafting system in the game. Take a material or two, add them together, get something else. Ice plus nutrient goo gives you food. Metal plus alkali gives you a battery. 3 pieces of metal gives you a handy scrapper. Yes, a handy scrapper. This is actually the tool you use most often in the game, so get used to it. It's definitely not what I would call a deep crafting system, but with such limited playtime, I wasn't expecting a Minecraft level of depth here. There does seem to be a crafting progression system where you unlock new tools, food options, and upgrades to your equipment as you explore new areas and discover new things. So I would anticipate this system does get deeper the more you play the game. Exploring is something you'll be doing a lot in this game. The game itself seems to be fairly linear in the overall major goals. You know which direction you need to go to complete the next major milestone, but there tend to be a few roadblocks preventing you from just going there quickly. There is a lot of wreckage scattered around the map that you'll be exploring to collect crafting materials and unlock new crafting recipes to allow you to get around and through these roadblocks. The initial roadblocks that impede your progress are a freezing dynamic that will cause you to freeze to death if you get too close to certain areas of the map, and a radiation dynamic that can cause you to die by getting too close to the ship's exposed core without proper protection built into your spacesuit. You can't do much about the freezing dynamic early in the game beyond getting close to these heat sources when you need to go into these dangerous areas. As you can see, the freezing itself is pretty obvious, so you'll have some good motivation to either get out of the area or get to a heater quickly. The radiation isn't something you have to worry about until you start getting to the second area of the map, which you won't be able to get to until you've crafted some upgrades for your suit, which you can't unlock until you've done a fair amount of exploring of the initial area of the game. Besides the obvious lack of air, which severely limits travel distance, these are the two initial roadblocks the developers throw at you. I assume that as the game progresses, new ones will appear and will force you to craft new equipment and continue to upgrade your suit. There's also a food and water mechanic in the game. You have to periodically eat and drink to keep your character alive. You do this by finding or crafting food and drinks to keep these bars topped off. There isn't any negative impact for when these bars are low or positive buff when they're full, so it's just something to keep an eye on. These bars also move pretty slowly, and looted food and water is very plentiful in the game, at least on the standard difficulty I play on. So this system didn't really have any impact on the game for me. It was just a mild nuisance that required me to further fill my already bursting inventory with food and water at all times. More on my problems with the inventory system later. As you've probably seen by now, the graphics in this game are very good. Not blow your socks off good, but very solid for a game from a new developer. The details in huge chunks of wreckage, the globs of liquid frozen in place by the coldest space, the planet and moons in the background, the exposed reactor core of the ship shining brightly at the distance. Everything looks really good. Developers did a good job of detailing and planning all of this out to give you the feeling that you really are in a shipwreck floating through space. The biggest plus for me in this game was the humor the developers built into it. This game is actually pretty funny. You can tell the developer spent a lot of time adding things into the game to try to make you laugh, which is great because it lets you forget about the oxygen meter for a couple seconds or even a few minutes while you build the crap imposed by the developers. Yeah, that's a real crafting recipe, and it looks quite a bit like a piece of the male anatomy? As you explore, you'll run into several of your previous crewmates that didn't fare as well as you during the ship crash. They all seem to be doing interesting things at the time of the crash. Exploring and discovering these are definitely a highlight of the game. There's also plenty of interesting and entertaining collectibles to find along the way that help break up the "oh my gosh, I'm gonna run out of air" monotony that this game tends to have with it. The game developers really did set this game up to be lighthearted and fun. A great example of the fun you're going to have with this game takes place in the very first minute. You wake up after the crash and find that you need to plug a gas leak with what little you have available to you, which in the first minute of the game is only a chicken. And that leads to entertaining results. Throughout the game, as you enter new areas and unlock new crafting materials, you'll be entertained with situations, messages, music that will at the very least make you chuckle. Hey, any game that lets you use a toilet is always funny in my book. Well, maybe they don't actually let you use the toilet. There is music in the game that's not the dark, "holy cow, get back to your ship, you're running out of air" music, but it only plays when you're in your ship. I really enjoyed the lightheartedness of this music. It provides kind of a stark contrast to the cold of space and the run out of air music. It brings a little smile to my face every time I hear it. But there really isn't much of a variety, at least in the early game. It can be turned off at the flip of a switch, though. Now for some things I'm not a huge fan of in this game. First, I want to talk about the movement. Well, I realize floating around in space in 3 dimensions creates a challenge for developers to come up with a movement system that is both smooth and easy to use. And for the most part, I think the game does a good job here. It's absolutely playable, often good, and 95% of the time works exactly like you'd expect. But I did find myself having to alternate left and right or up and down to keep my crosshair steady in a task or a resource I was trying to get. Like I said, I get it, you're in space. There isn't any gravity, and moving around can be extremely difficult. But it's a game that needs to be fun and simple. So personally, I think some work needs to be done here. Maybe play around with the acceleration and deceleration rates to dial this in. Next is the inventory and crafting system itself. Like I said, in this game you'll spend a huge amount of time collecting resources, bringing them to your base, and using them to create useful items. Being a loot hoarder and somewhat of a game completionist myself, I spent a lot of time at the beginning of the game collecting a lot of things. So many things, in fact, that I overfilled my inventory in the first chest you get in the game very quickly. I ended up needing to literally pile loot up in the ship because I didn't have places to store it all. And because there are quite a few different types of materials needed to build the various tools and equipment, you need to have a fair amount of materials on hand at your base. Eventually, you get access to a chest-type item that can be crafted and used to create additional storage space, but early in the game, this lack of space gets annoying quickly. Now, I get that you can't give new players an infinite amount of space to store all their loot. This system is inherently fine, but the main problems I had are, 1, the crafting system tends to really favor a small handful of items to build the vast majority of the things in the game. You'll end up collecting a ton of various materials, but only really need large amounts of 1 or 2 of them. Of course, you don't know this early in the game, so you end up keeping everything, only to not have enough space to store it. Problem 2 for me was the fact that I spent all this time collecting all of these materials, only to leave it behind after you get to the second zone in the game. Once you venture far enough out, you end up finding a new home base from your original one. Because of the oxygen problem, getting from one base to the other takes a long time and is not something you want to repeat again and again. The only way to transfer your items from one base to the other is to carry things by hand. If you want to bring everything from your first base to your second, it would take many trips back and forth. This would literally take hours and not be fun at all. The second base you find does seem to have a fair amount of stock of the basic materials that you need to continue progress in the game, so shuttling loot from your first base isn't really required, but this just cements my feeling that I wasted a lot of time in the very early game collecting and storing all these materials, thinking I'm setting myself up for success later in the game, only to have them never be seen or used again. Eventually, I'm sure you get a vehicle or something making it much easier to get around and carry items from point A to point B, but in the first several hours of the game, it's just frustrating. Next is tool durability. There is a large handful of tools that you need to craft and have on you at pretty much all points in the game. This is because some resources require you to use certain tools to loot them. One to drill into asteroids to get metal, another to scan objects to open doors or to learn new crafting recipes, another to, well, bash things to open them. You bash a lot of things in this game, by the way. Now, I don't have any problem with the tools themselves and the mechanics associated with requiring several of them to perform various tasks. It's that each of these tools has a durability that diminishes with each use, and the initial durability of these items seems very low. You'll end up having to carry a couple of some of the commonly used tools around with you at all times, since it's not at all uncommon for you to use more than one of these up on a single excursion away from your ship. Keep in mind that there may be some more durable tools that become available later in the game, but for at least the first 5 hours, you're stuck with the tools that are frustratingly fragile. I feel like these could use a 25 to 50% durability buff to cut down this pain. I also wish that when one would break, and if you had another one in your inventory, it would automatically place that new one in the hotbar spot where the previous one was. Having to bring up your inventory and bind the fresh tool to your hotbar in the middle of an EVA where you're constantly worried about running out of air is unnecessarily frustrating. I hesitated to even bring this small hotbar gripe up, but with the durability being so low, this does happen. A lot. And that brings up my last minor gripe, the hotbar itself. Why does it only have 4 slots? At any given point in time, you're carrying 5 or 6 tools around with you. Why not have a hotbar big enough for everything? Having to open up your inventory and swap these out constantly while trying not to suffocate gets old really fast. I don't think the small hotbar provides any value to the game other than making things less fun. Before I give you my final conclusions on the first 5 hours of this game, I'll give you a few non-spoiler tips to help you get up to speed on things and progress the game faster than I did if you decide to buy it. I don't have a ton of, OMG, I wish I had known that tips for this game. The game does do a fair job explaining things along the way, but there were a couple things that weren't immediately apparent to me, or things that I found later than I probably should have, and it would have been helpful to know that a bit earlier. Number 1 is inventory space. I mentioned the problems I had with inventory space, so I recommend you find the suitcase as early as you can in the game, before you really collect and hoard too many of each of the basic materials. This will save you some frustration as you try to find places for everything in your ship. Number 2 is the oxygen station. Build it. It's super helpful and can be recharged fairly easily. Don't be afraid to build several of them and place them around your map. They remove a lot of stress when branching out to explore new areas, especially the ones far away from your ship. Number 3 is that materials are pretty plentiful in this game, but there are some that can be a bit harder to find and are really critical in order to get some of the more advanced equipment in the game. For me, this was aluminum. For some reason, it took me way too long to figure out where to get this from, so I just figure I'll tell you now. Asteroids. It's found on various asteroids around the crash site. You can use your drill to mine it out. So, in summary, overall, the pros of this game, it's a fun idea. It has some solid core gameplay. It's a very funny game, it's entertaining, you will smile as you play it, and the graphics are pretty good. Cons, there's more listed here, but I think they're all fairly small. The big one for me is just the constant battle with air can be a bit tiring for people that aren't familiar with this type of game. So if you've played a Subnautica, you'll be totally in tune with this. If you haven't, it can be kind of frustrating. The second con is the controls can be mildly frustrating at times. It is a 3D space game. It is kind of difficult to move around, but once you get used to it, you'll be just fine. The third con is inventory space and moving things around in the game from point A to point B. You just don't have enough inventory space on your character. I'd really like to see this expanded a bit, say 25% in future versions of the game. The fourth con is tool durability. Please make these tools last longer. You'll burn through tools so quickly and have to fill your inventory space with duplicates just to be able to get the resources you need during your excursions outside of your base. And lastly, simple one, hotbar. Make it larger. Why is it only 4 slots? So, after 5 hours of Breathedge, I give this game a solid C+, which kind of leads to the next question. Do I plan on playing this game more, and would I recommend to you that you should pick it up? I do think I'll play this game for another few hours. I want to get to the point in the game where you can build vehicles and have the ability to craft a base, which may solve a lot of the little issues I have with the game. Overall, balancing the pros and cons of the game along with the reasonable $20 price tag makes this game just worth it in my mind. I'd recommend it for people that like this type of single-player survival game. If you're not typically into these types of survival games, I don't think this is the one you want to cut your teeth on. I recommend you pass on this one. And that's it. Thanks for your time. If you like this video and want to see more like it, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing. This truly is my first game review on YouTube, and I'd like to continue making more if people like the content. If you have any recommendations for what I can do differently or better, or even some suggestions of games you'd like me to review in future videos, please let me know in the comment section below. Thanks for your time, and I'll see you in the next video.